So I want to talk about the believing brain. The new book, I'll just give you just the quick rundown, the Reader's Digest condensed version of it. So I start off with basically in my first book, Why People Believe Weird Things. This is sort of the bookend of that, 10 books later, 9 books later. That is, I'm interested in not just why people believe weird things, but why people believe anything at all. And in this sense, the weird things are a subset of things. You have to believe things, so we end up believing weird things because we're not good at discriminating between true things and weird things or non-things or false things or whatever. So my thought experiment is, imagine you're a hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago and your name is Lucy. Thank you, some people get that. A lot of people in the Midwest don't get that. Lucy? Who's Lucy? You know, the little hominid, 3.5 feet tall. Anyway. And I'm reminded of the Gary Larson cartoon of the Australopithecines in the cave party, and the guy's going, "You're not the Lucy." Hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago, and you hear a rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator, or is it just the wind? Well, if you think it's a dangerous predator, and it turns out it's just the wind, you've made a type 1 error, a false positive. You've connected A to B, but A is not really connected to B. You made a mistake in thinking, but that's a low-cost error to make. No harm. You're just more skittish and careful and cautious and vigilant, and you move around the weird noise, and that's pretty much the end of that. And we've all seen on the fur, fin, and feather shows what animals are like out in the wild. They're fairly skittish, especially preyed upon animals. On the other hand, if you think the rustle in the grass is just the wind and it turns out it's a dangerous predator, you're lunch. Congratulations, you've been given a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool without reproducing. So in other words, I'm arguing that there was a natural selection for making one kind of error versus another kind of error. Type 1 error is fairly low cost, type 2 errors are high cost. So using an evolutionary theory model based called Hamilton's rule, basically why we would be nice to other people that are not our twins or our immediate offspring, there's a whole series of formulas for how much energy you put into a system, how much risk you take, and so on, versus what the benefits are, cost-benefit ratio. So I show in the book the formula of how this works and why we would tend to have a selection process for making one kind of error versus the other kind of error. That is, the rule of thumb is just believe everything you hear and see just in case it's real. Because there's no time, well, okay, so why can't we get it right? Why can't we just sit there in the grass collecting more data to see if it's a dangerous predator or just the wind? And the answer is because that will also get you taken out and eaten for lunch. That is, sitting there collecting more data is itself a costly, risky process. So it's much better to make snap, intuitive, rapid decisions based on minimal data because there's no time to collect more data. So our brains have all this capacity or this propensity to just make really fast decisions. And that's what all the research in cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and so on. The Enlightenment vision of humans as rational calculators, maximizing our utility and our happiness and making these rational choices through free will is an illusion. None of that is true. That isn't how we do it. We stand there in front of the toothpaste section in the supermarket and we just grab the one because it's blue or whatever. We recognize the logo. We don't sit there and analyze the ingredients and so on. And all our decisions are made that way, from toothpaste to spouses to jobs and careers and houses and so on. We rarely do rational calculations. And so the reason people believe weird things is because we have to make rapid cognitions about believing all sorts of things. The rule of thumb is just believe pretty much everything. And this is why everybody, including skeptics and scientists, tend to fall into the trap of just believing things because that's what we heard or we were raised that way or so on. The difference is, of course, as I'll finish up at the end of this little talk, the science has a built-in self-correcting mechanism called the scientific method with peer review and corroboration and checking and rechecking and blind and double-blind conditions and all this, because scientists are no better at this than anybody else. Every scientist would love his pet theory to be true. They can advance their career much more rapidly, win prizes, gain raises, and so on, by having their particular pet theory turn out to be true. So, of course, they're going to succumb to the confirmation bias where they look for and find confirmatory evidence for what they already believe and ignore the disconfirming evidence. Everybody does it. So it's not just political ideologues and economic ideologues and religious people and so on. Everybody, all of us, every one of us has this problem. So I call this belief-dependent realism. There is a real world, but our understanding of it is dependent on our beliefs. Most of our beliefs are arrived at for non-smart reasons, non-rational reasons. We were raised that way, emotional, subjective elements to it. Family background, siblings, peer groups, teachers, mentors, books that we read, influence of culture, and so on. All that shapes our beliefs, and then we employ our cortex with our great ability to rationalize and collect all the data we need to support it. So that's how it works. And I have quite a bit of research showing the research on this, how it's related to the levels of uncertainty in the environment. The more uncertain the environment is, the more anxious you are in a particular situation, the more likely you are to fall into these traps of just believing things, finding patterns. I call that patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in random noise. By the way, those of you who've asked me, why did you create a new name? Why not just use pareidolia? Because I can hardly pronounce pareidolia anyway. And that isn't what I mean. I don't mean the process of just seeing the face of Jesus in a tortilla or the Virgin Mary on the side of a building or grilled cheese sandwich. I mean all kinds of patterns. And that we have to find patterns and learn and connect the dots. That's what we do. That's what I'm really talking about with patternicity, all sorts of patterns. And that the more uncertain the environment is, the more likely you are to see patterns. It seems to happen more in the right hemisphere than the left hemisphere. There's a whole body of research on these different things. Dopamine appears to be related to it. The more input from dopamine you get through experiments by giving subjects L-Dopa, for example, they're more likely to see illusory patterns that aren't there. So we're kind of starting to hone down on where in the brain this happens, why it happens, what the neurochemical transmitters are related to finding these patterns, and this is all connected to how the brain works and how we learn. And we should be cautious not to be too critical of people that find lots of patterns. We have to be careful about this because although, and you know this classic skeptic's line, you know, keep a mind open enough to see radical new ideas, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out. Well, that is a truism because, and I have a whole section in that chapter on creativity and madness. See, patternicity, this isn't a bad thing. It's often a good thing. Seeing new patterns that no one else has ever seen, that is the basis of creativity and genius. This is how you make a new discovery in science or create a new genre in music or a new style in art. The problem is that if your brain is kind of wired up to be super creative and see patterns all over the place, maybe you also see patterns that aren't real. And so my favorite example that I use in the book is say the difference between Richard Feynman and John Nash. Feynman wins the Nobel Prize in physics for his discovery of these components to quantum electrodynamics and Feynman diagrams, where he sees a vision in his head of how these subatomic particles interact, and he sketches them out, and he put them on the side of his van, which you can still see if you ever get to Southern California. I'll take you to see it. His van with the famous Feynman diagrams on the side. And as the story goes, he was driving up Lake Boulevard there from Pasadena up to Altadena, where I live and he lived, and with big Feynman diagrams on the side of his van, and somebody rolls down the window at the stop sign and says, "How come you have Feynman diagrams on your van?" And he said, "Because I'm Feynman," which I thought that'd be really cool to be able to say that. And then by contrast, John Nash won the Nobel Prize in economics for his discovery of the mathematical relationships of subjects in games. So game theory, prisoner's dilemma, ultimatum games, these sorts of things. There's something called Nash equilibrium of how contestants in a contest, a game, whether it's something like prisoner's dilemma or whether it's nations in a Cold War state or anything like that, people in relationships, business contracts and whatnot, they reach this Nash equilibrium. Anyway, that's not important. What's important is that John Nash was also seeing patterns that no one else saw. And if you see enough weird patterns, it's actually called schizophrenia. And you remember he's the subject of A Beautiful Mind, and he described in the book, anyway, when asked, why is it you think aliens are talking to you and there's secret government agents that talk to you? And he said, because it's the same source I get for my mathematics of understanding game theory. In other words, there's no discriminatory tool in the brain to tell the difference between these patterns over here that turn out to be real, so important you win a Nobel Prize for it, and these patterns over here that are just madness. So there is a fine line between creativity and madness. And now there's an extensive database. Nancy Andreessen, University of Iowa, is probably the best source for this. Her database, anyway, these are all super creative people that have won prizes in their fields. And and so on, and she brings them to the university and scans their brains and so on. A significant percentage of them have different degrees of mental illness, either manic depression or schizophrenia, or either them or their immediate family members. So there's something genetically programming the brain to see lots of patterns. On the one hand, this is good. On the other hand, it may not be so good. So, right, the rub is finding the balance there. Okay, back to our thought experiment. Hominid on the plains of Africa 3.5 million years ago, Russell in the grass, dangerous predator. Is it a dangerous predator or just the wind? What's the difference between the wind and a dangerous predator? The wind is an inanimate object. The dangerous predator is an intentional agent. The difference between being an inanimate force and an intentional agent is what I call agenticity, the tendency to infuse these patterns with intentional agents that operate secretly, invisibly, controlling the world, running things. Whether these are gods and ghosts and spirits and demons and angels or conspiracies, our brains also tend to, because we're natural-born dualists, tend to think that there's two things, corporeal and incorporeal, body and soul, brain and mind. And I have a little pet peeve in the book about quit using mind words. It's probably the result of my recent experiences with Deepak, of using these mind words, because it's too fuzzy. It doesn't tell us anything. It makes us think that there's something else in mind that's besides the substrate, the brain itself. But we know that, in fact, if you destroy parts of the brain through tumors or brain injury or strokes or Alzheimer's, dementia, senility, as the neurons die, the brain function, the mind, whatever you want to call it, dies with it. As your brain dies, your memories die. Where do they go without the brain? This was my contention with Deepak. Where is Aunt Millie's mind when her brain goes from Alzheimer's? And by God, he had an answer. You want to know what it was? The Matrix. The Matrix. I said, great. Where do I get that other than Netflix? Without the substrate, there's no mind, right? So, but nevertheless, we tend to think that there's a dualistic force, an essence that continues on. All the good research on this by Bruce Hood and Paul Bloom at Yale and others that, for example, if you ask subjects, would you wear Hitler's sweater? Almost everybody goes, oh, no, because it's like infused with evilness, like evil is a thing, a substance, that it really exists outside of people. But would you wear Mr. Rogers' cardigan sweater? Oh, yes, it would feel so warm and make me feel moral and upstanding. And one of these guys put up Brad Pitt's sweater on eBay for sale. Washed or unwashed? Which one do you think got the most money? Yeah, of course, everybody wants the essence of Brad Pittness or whatever that would be. Now, there may be evolutionary reasons for this. Scent has good and bad properties to it. The sense of disgust, the things that smell really bad and make us have an emotion of disgust usually tend to be things related to bodily excrements and communicable diseases, things like that we probably shouldn't get too close to. Because in our evolutionary history, they probably did cause widespread disease, something like that. So there's a good reason why we have a repulsion for things that are bad, especially if they smell bad or related to that, versus something like the scent of your lover or somebody you love, or some good smells like flowers or roses or whatever. These bring on a good sense of a positive emotion. And so that would then maybe be connected in this essentialistic way to good behavior, moral behavior, and that sort of thing. Anyway, I have a long discussion about that, but the problem is that the process is that we then naturally tend to believe in invisible agents. So, so then I have chapters on God and the afterlife. These are obviously elements of that. So although, yes, of course, I can't prove there's no God, I think I build a pretty good case to show that there's lots of positive evidence to show that we create gods in our brains. And exactly how this happens and where it happens in the brain, it's not one place. God's too complex of an idea to happen in just one little spot. But I show how this whole essentialism, dualism, this agenticity, and all this stuff sort of combines into different parts of the brain to gel into this idea of a God. Not just Yahweh God, but any God, invisible gods, lots of gods, polytheistic gods, animistic gods, spirits of any kind, demons, angels, and so forth. And then you can just take that from brain, neuroscience, behavior genetics, about 50% of pretty much everything we believe is heritable.